Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another video about The Last of Us, where I've already done a 6-hour retrospective talking about all of my thoughts on the original game, yet here we are for the 10-year anniversary of its DLC, and I'll be doing the same thing, talking through my detailed thoughts on Left Behind, which all around is a nice addition to the main story, obviously largely focusing on Ellie and showing her backstory and giving more depth to her character. Now, straight up, I don't have as much of a connection to Left Behind as I do with the main game, where I actually didn't play Left Behind until years after I played the original game. Not playing it until I played the PS4 remaster in early 2017. Though since then, I've played it dozens of times, and it's a DLC that has us cutting back and forth between two time periods, one of which obviously acting as a prequel to the main game, taking place around 3 weeks before Ellie meets Joel, highlighting Ellie's relationship with Riley, a friend she previously mentioned in the main game, while the other time period is during the course of the main game, taking place after the university chapter where Joel is obviously impaled, and through that ends up showcasing Ellie's adventures in finding medical supplies to tend to Joel. Which, while that portion of the game can be seen as just an excuse to have combat in the DLC, which there's very little of, with this DLC focusing a lot more on exploration and narrative, I do still really like its thematic role in the story, being used to highlight how Ellie was impacted by her experiences with Riley and how that relationship parallels to her relationship with Joel, adding more to the tragedy that is the ending of the original game. Now, with that said, I don't feel like Left Behind is an essential piece of the Last of Us experience. I do think it executes what it attempts to do very well, with it progressing the development of Ellie's character while also proving to be a unique gameplay experience, particularly from the flashback sections. I just feel like this piece of downtime, which is rarely emphasized in the Last of Us series, which makes this DLC a nice change of pace for the series. And through it has a lot of merit in its own right, being again a very well-made, shorter experience here, but again one that doesn't feel like it's necessary to play to truly get what makes the Last of Us series great. But with that, let's get into the meat and bones of the video, where like my previous retrospective, I'll be running through the DLC from beginning to end, detailing my thoughts along the way. Now, I am going to give a spoiler warning here for the entire Last of Us series, including the HBO show and even the comic American Dreams, as I'll be making references to them along the way. But with that, let's start talking about the DLC, to where it starts off with its first chapter, Back in a Flash, where this DLC is broken up into 6 chapters, with the transition points essentially being whenever you change in time periods, which is a nice structuring to this game, though it does lead to a lot of imbalance in terms of the length of these chapters, the flashback sequences being much longer than the sequences in the present, though again, at the end of the day, that doesn't really change anything of substance. Now, the DLC does begin with a short recap of the events of the university chapter, where we do see Joel and Ellie's escape, and Joel's subsequent falling off the horse after passing out, where his life was obviously left ambiguous at that point in the main story. And I know there is some talk about how this DLC should be played when you reach that point in the main story, though that is something I do feel like is extremely misguided, where, again, I feel like this was a DLC for a reason. There's a reason they didn't include this as part of the main story, as one, it's again, not that important to truly grasp the story of the original game, but even beyond that, I think it really breaks up the pacing of the original game, while also taking away a lot of the suspense from Joel's condition being unknown by the time you cut to the winter chapter, which takes a lot of intrigue away from the winter chapter, while also giving you probably a bit too much insight into Ellie's POV, as it gives you a bit more context on how she's feeling by the end of the game through showing more of her relationship with Riley, that I think ends up skewing the complexity of the ending as well. By the way, the cutscene does continue by taking us into the flashback, with us getting an opening shot of Ellie lying asleep on her bunk bed, adding more to these parallels of Sarah, with this obviously mirroring the opening shot of the OG game. But obviously you end up piecing together that this is Ellie in the military preparatory school in Boston, as she obviously refers to in the original game. This obviously again taking place weeks before she even meets Joel in that game, with this giving us an insight on what her life was like before she ended up getting bitten. But eventually we hear someone entering the room, and that person ends up climbing on top of Ellie, imitating a clicker, and ends up fake biting her to awaken her, and Ellie throws this mysterious figure off of her and instantly grabs her switchblade, showing her resourcefulness there. But afterwards, she ends up recognizing her assaulter, this obviously being Riley, her childhood friend, who was again mentioned in the original game, where again a lot of this DLC ends up being an exploration of the relationship between Ellie and Riley. And really that is the heart and soul of this DLC, with these essentially being the only two true characters of this DLC. And really the chemistry between these two characters ends up being really integral to this DLC's success, where again, the bulk of what makes this DLC successful is its narrative. And had the casting or even just the chemistry between these two characters not been as strong as it is, it simply just wouldn't work. But thankfully, we do get strong performances from both Ashley Johnson and Yanni King, where obviously Ashley Johnson's performance here is on par for her in the original game, still matching the wide-eyed amazement that she had there, along with the sharp wit that her character exudes, where Yanni King, who plays Riley, is obviously new for this game, and her performance is also really strong here. Again, pretty much matching the quality of acting that we see from most characters in the original game, being able to keep on par with the performance of Ellie as well, and ends up being just an interesting character here, one that clearly has a lot more motivations than what are initially stated, and her performance ends up exuding a lot of subtext to it that makes the character really pop here. But anyway, this initial conversation ends up highlighting the complexity of their relationship, with really clearly having a chip on her shoulder throughout most of this DLC, with their last conversation clearly not ending well, and Riley having seemingly left Ellie, and Riley here seeming to be trying to win her back. And Riley's obviously initially playful during this conversation, seeming to try to act as if there's no bad blood between the two, though Ellie is clearly annoyed at her hijinks, to where while Riley is still joking around, she does eventually notice that Ellie is still holding her blade up to her, with Riley saying, "You're not gonna kill me, are you?" Leading to Ellie putting away the blade, but still being upset at her, saying, "I haven't seen you in I don't know how long," only for Riley to instantly respond with 45 days, 46 technically, obviously alluding to the fact that it's past midnight. But through this, it really does show you the care that Riley does have for her relationship with Ellie, the fact that she has the days since their last conversation etched in her brain. And while it's obviously not revealed until much later, you can clearly tell the romantic undertones in their relationship, feeling like typical teenage love of these two characters, constantly trying to impress each other and show each other that they care. But here we do see Ellie still being upset, saying that she thought that she was dead, clearly showing her care for her, but also kind of being this tragic line, as obviously she later does end up being dead. But also when looking back at the original game, we know all the guilt that she feels for surviving over those that she loves. This obviously showing already that this is something that's top of mind for her. But it's in this instant where we do have Riley removing the pendant from around her neck, passing it to Ellie, revealing that she is now a Firefly. Obviously a group that we come to know very well in the original game. And this is something that's also referred to back in American Dreams, where I guess I should talk about what American Dreams is, and the fact that it is a comic mini-series that actually started to release even before the original game, and in many ways Left Behind here acts as a direct sequel to it, with the comics showing the initial meeting between Ellie and Riley, while also introducing concepts that we'll see later expanded in this DLC, some which were even mentioned in the original game, and also showing their first interaction with the Fireflies, which is also referred to here as well. All of it being an interesting comic that maybe I'll do a video on it at some point. But again, there's obviously a lot of cool references to it across this DLC, with again her plan on wanting to join the Fireflies being one of those. Though it is at this point where Riley notices that Ellie still has no roommates, really emphasizing how much the loss of Riley end up leaving Ellie alone here, though it does end up noticing a photo of her and Ellie still hanging on her wall, with her recognizing that Ellie does still care for her. Though again, there's clearly still tension in this scene, with Ellie checking the hallway to make sure they don't get caught, especially now there's a Firefly in her room. Riley ends up asking her if they're cool, to which Ellie ends up scoffing it off. But this is when Riley says that I disappeared and you're mad, and I owe you an explanation, to where she wants Ellie to leave with her in the middle of the night so that she can tell her about it. This obviously being the basis around this DLC, this trip that Riley ends up taking Ellie on, which is obviously this attempt to repair their relationship, also being the core premise of the flashback sequences here, and also being the inciting incident that causes the events of the main game to happen. As we do see Ellie reluctantly agreeing to go with her, which is when we do end up cutting back to the present, where Ellie has now carried Joel to a rundown ice cream parlor inside of a Colorado mall, with Ellie rummaging through some drawers, searching for something that can help Joel out, ending up finding some duct tape that she uses to tape up his wound with the shirt that she wore during summer in order to buy him some time, to which she ends up deciding to leave him here and attempt to find something that will be able to stitch him up, promising to be back in a flash, which, what do you know, is the name of this chapter. but Ellie ends up pulling the shutters closed, which we finally get to the title card, and finally ends up taking us to gameplay as we play as Ellie as she explores the mall, looking for supplies, clearly being nervous as she takes off, instantly saying that she totally got this, in this way that feels like she's trying to convince herself of that. So we do start it all off in a plaza that is pretty wide in scope, though contains nothing of real substance in it, clearly being set up to be used for a combat encounter later on. Though already in this opening section, I feel like it's time to talk about some major glitches that are in this game, particularly those that are used in any speedruns that do funnily allow you to skip the majority of the DLC, where if you pay attention to the design of this section of the game, the entire DLC is laid out in a way that has you essentially going around in circles, where this portion of the game is essentially you just heading out to find a military copter, which is in the plaza nearby, and then heading directly back to this location, meaning that the locations that you go to towards the end of the DLC are very close to this starting position, which has led to speedrunners finding a way to deload the entire area through climbing up to the top floor in a precise way that has you moving the camera in a way that allows you to find your way into the penultimate room before the final encounter. That allows you to just play from that point on if you're able to get into that room. And even more recently, there's been even more glitches found that allow you to glitch through the garage door into the room or even through one of the side walls. But either way, all of this really allowing you to finish the game in about 5 minutes, which is obviously really ridiculous when you think about it, and does just make it really humorous, the glitchy nature of this game. But the more typical way to play the game involves you walking up the escalator to find some stores on the left side of the top floor, which when approaching you do hear some infected in the distance, though finally none of them are actually spawned in at this point. So really it's just there to add tension to this scene, though really you could just explore at will. Now really there's not much to find, as there's really nothing but the basic throwables outside of the stores, though the way to progress is conveniently going to the only store that ends up actually being open, that being Weston's Pharmacy. I guess a chain of pharmacies in the Last of Us world, as it does make another appearance in Last of Us 2, though this one ends up being completely looted, and while there are numerous objects that interact with here, you really end up finding nothing until you attempt to open the back door, which is where Ellie will notice a first aid kit on the ground through the window, but obviously she can't reach it without a key to the door, to which searching for a key has you coming across a note on the ground that tells you that the pharmacist ended up getting infected and was locked away in a nearby American Princess store, with the note also giving you a combination to lock open that store, to where you end up backtracking a bit and end up interacting with the lock that has Ellie unlocking the lock in a cutscene, which is kind of strange after having come from playing part 2, where obviously there they would allow you to put the combination in yourself, though obviously this is technically the way that safes worked in the OG game, so I guess it shouldn't be that big of a surprise. But once inside, you end up finding the store filled with spores, though obviously with Ellie having immunity, she's safe from them, though finding your way to the back of the store has you finding the dead pharmacist, with the cordyceps having spread and him being attached to the wall, though Ellie ends up finding the key on him, and conveniently as she does so, the body ends up slopping over, which is this pretty pathetic attempt at a jump scare, though on him you can also find a photo of him and his assumed wife, obviously from before the outbreak. That does add a little bit of world building here. Though when leaving the store, you do notice that the clicker we heard earlier has actually finally spawned in, which ends up being our first opportunity for a combat encounter. Now in this section, Ellie will not have any ammo, only having her switchblade and the bricks that are around the open world, though it's really the only options to kill it here are killing it from behind or throwing a brick at it and killing it when it's stunned, or really you could just run by it, as once you reach the pharmacy it can't catch up to you anyway. But anyway, getting back to the pharmacy does allow you to unlock the back door, to which it's revealed that the first aid kit was empty. So that was kind of a waste, though as she kicks the case away, she ends up noticing a military helicopter crash through the roof of the nearby plaza, which now the plan is to head towards it, to which we end up having to navigate through an abandoned salon, crawling through some rubble, which really feels like a bit of unnecessary gameplay there. Along the way, you can find a dead soldier who ends up having a note and a health kit next to him, but conveniently the health kit doesn't help with fixing up Joel, I guess, because obviously they don't want the DLC to be done that quickly, though it does end up being beneficial for gameplay reasons, as for some reason Ellie only starts this DLC at half health, which I guess adds to the immersion, as obviously she wouldn't be in good shape considering this is immediately after university. She'd obviously been lugging Joel around, so it's kind of an interesting little quirk there. As mentioned, there's also a note here which kind of starts the series of collectibles that are in the modern day play in this game, which all largely revolve around the story behind the soldiers from the helicopter, eventually revealing what ended up happening to them, though really it's a story that I never found too interesting. But anyway, the chapter does end with us exiting the salon and descending some stairs and jumping over a railing, taking us to the second chapter of the DLC called Mallrats, with us obviously transitioning back to the flashback, which again, these flashback sequences for the most part are these moments of downtime, largely focusing around Ellie and Riley, with no real threat from human enemies or infected, with the gameplay here being more so based around exploration, with no combat involved, feeling more like you hanging out with your childhood best friend, or maybe even something more, but obviously gives this very different tone to what you would expect from the series. Now, chapter does start with us instantly seeing Ellie and Riley jumping into a building, having just avoided being seen by a patrol of soldiers, to which Riley ends up instantly complimenting Ellie's speed, again adding to the flirtatious tone of their conversations, though here we have our first bit of gameplay in the flashback, with us playing as Ellie as we navigate through the abandoned building with Riley, passing through some apartments along the way, and straight up gameplay wise, this section is kind of tedious, where it's really just a lot of just following Riley, though again it does do quite a bit narratively, and that allows these two to talk, giving us a further expansion on their dynamic and their background, where Riley ends up talking about her experiences with the Fireflies, and talks about how she ended up joining them, mentioning a Firefly named Trevor, which the way she says it in the game has been in a way that has always made me laugh for some reason, but this ends up being a character that did briefly appear in American Dreams, with the moment referenced here of Ellie having bit him was the moment in that comic, though Riley ends up talking about having followed him and ended up being ambushed by the Fireflies, who end up bringing her to Marlene, to which at this point it is pretty obvious that Ellie already knows who Marlene is, obviously due to what happened in American Dream, which is a radical departure from the HBO show, where in the HBO show Ellie didn't even know who Marlene was until after the events of Left Behind, which I think is stupid. And to be honest, even this version isn't ideal, as I do very much like the interpretation that you can get from the OG game a lot more, where Ellie and Marlene were extremely close, due to the connection that Marlene had to Ellie's mom, and through that it ends up further adding more complexity to Marlene's decision at the end of the game, and also more complexity to Joel's decision at the end of the original game. Though the way the HBO show and even American Dream handles it is in a way that kind of nullifies that through saying that Ellie didn't really know Marlene that well at all. Now again, I still think the canon version of the events, the one that comes from American Dream, is still better in the fact that at least she had known her for a bit and does know about how close Marlene was to her mother, but at the end of the day, it still means that Ellie has only known Marlene for a short period of time, which makes their overall dynamic a bit strange. Now, I'm not complaining about this as if this is a retcon or anything, as again, most of American Dream came out before the original game came out. And while, I mean, the original game was probably written before American Dream, they were at least in production at the same time, to where this is something that seems to clearly just be what Neil Druckmann wanted, though it's still a decision that I think kind of nullifies some of the events from the original game. But anyway, Riley here talks about Marlene accepting her in and saying, "What took you so long?" To which Marlene claims that it was all a test to see if she was committed, which is kind of dumb, though I guess this is just a thing Marlene does of just constantly testing people, which is later implied as well. Now again, this conversation is being had while passing through a number of apartment rooms, most of which don't really have much of substance in them. Now there's obviously environmental world building through all this, as you would expect from The Last of Us, with some anti-Fedra graffiti and everything obviously just being straight up run down. And there is a very minor collectible along the way of it just being a Marlene wanted poster, but eventually they end up reaching a room with a broken roof, which has them climbing up to the following floor. There's around here where Riley will mention that Marlene asks about Riley and talks about her resemblance to her mom, to which Ellie clearly shows some resentment towards that, saying that she'd know more than me, clearly already feeling this notion of her being left behind by her own mother, a notion that just gets further emphasized through her later loss of all the loved ones she loses along the way. But anyway, on the next floor here, we have them shimmying along a ledge, where now the talk transitions to Ellie mentioning not having people to hang around anymore, and that the ones that she used to talk to were all Riley's friends, emphasizing how alone she feels. Though it is when we get to the following room that we get our first optional conversation of the game, with them seeing a Firefly emblem all on the wall, and Ellie asking Riley if she really buys into the Firefly's philosophy, and Riley saying that all she knows is that she's not a soldier, being this line that clearly just shows you how bad it is in the quarantine zones, with her main motivation for sticking with the Fireflies is simply because it's better than the alternative. Though as we walk along, we do end up hearing the intercom lady talking, obviously this voice that we also heard in in the original game, which obviously just divvies out rules and propaganda from Fedra, with this time her talking about how the zone has been void of infection for 30 days, with Riley scoffing at that, talking about how people get infected all the time. They've just done a better way at hiding it, once again highlighting the corruption of Fedra, though this also leads to talk about how Riley has run into infected as a Firefly, and part of her initiation was killing one, though that seems to be a traumatic experience for her, one that she doesn't go into too much detail on. Anyway, we have the two eventually reaching the rooftop, which ends up giving us this pretty cool visual of the Boston skyline at night. Anyway, dropping down a ledge leads to an in-game cutscene here where Riley ends up noticing a patrol passing by, and we end up hiding from it, even though it's way into distance, with Riley saying that she's been a little jumpy lately, showing you how scary it is to be living as a Firefly. Though continuing along, Ellie ends up joking about how she should become a Firefly, an idea that Riley instantly diffuses, saying that she has already asked Marlene about this, to which Marlene ended up refusing, saying that she didn't want Riley even seeing Ellie, and that she's not even supposed to be here, saying that Marlene wants to keep Ellie safe, once again showing the care that Marlene does have for Ellie, showing Marlene as Ellie's protector figure from a distance, though also does show Riley going out of her way to meet up with Ellie, showing Riley risking her own standing with the Fireflies to be seeing Ellie here. But eventually, the group does reach their destination, that being Liberty Gardens, a abandoned mall, another location from American Dreams, which ends up being pretty faithfully recreated here, with a lot of the panels from that comic looking just like it does in the game. Though with that, I guess I should also mention the fact that this is literally another mall, obviously very similar to the location that we're at in the modern day. Now, originally, I believe this was done largely due to budgetary reasons, obviously, of not having to completely redesign a separate location, allowing them to reuse assets, though I do think it actually works to the DLC's benefit in adding to these parallel between timelines, adding to this reason why Ellie is thinking of these memories in the instances that she is, something lost in the HBO version, where obviously there, the entire mall section in the present is completely taken out. But while dropping in, we do have Riley asking, do you remember the first time I brought you here? Obviously alluding to this being a common hideout for the two, clearly trying to bring up these feelings of nostalgia, but Ellie clearly ignores her, just asking her why they're here, with Riley saying that she has a surprise for her, with again all this clearly being set up to be Riley trying to make it up to her, while also building up this mystery of what this surprise can be, with Ellie instantly asking if it's a dinosaur, adding to the fun-loving naivety of Ellie, though at the same time ends up being a line that's followed up on in The Last of Us 2, which is a cool callback in that game, where Ellie literally says the same line to Joel in the birthday gift chapter, to where he ends up literally taking her to a museum that does have dinosaur replicas. Now, it is also during this section where we do get a number of optional conversations, a lot of them being very easily missed, where whether or not you can interact with them is largely based on where Riley is in the world, and through that, if you go too far, Riley won't come back to you if you try to go to these locations to start these conversations, which can be kind of annoying if you're going for 100%. But the first one here ends up being them talking about their dreams of taking a vacation, with talk of them having settled down on wanting to go to LA to go surfing, something that we obviously will never see them do. Later on, we do see them see a poster for some water guns, with Ellie mentioning that she almost got her water guns back after they were confiscated from Corporal Dickhead, and that she had snuck into his office and had them in her hands only for her ass to get caught, getting her scrubbing duty for 2 weeks, really highlighting how strict prep schools are and how miserable Ellie is from staying there, while also, again, showing her childlike innocence and her love of water guns, something that Riley tells her to give up on them, saying that they're never coming back, to where with context of what happens later in the game, this is Riley really subduing Ellie's expectations just to add to the surprise later on. But anyway, we end up descending through some broken escalators, to which on the bottom floor we have them finding an abandoned tent, a tent that belonged to Winston, a character from American Dreams, with again this area that the tent is in is again just perfectly recreated from those scenes in the comics. And Winston's also a character that is referred to in the OG game as well, being the person that taught Ellie how to ride a horse, a moment we do see in American Dream, but is in this section where we do get a bevy of optional conversations as well, with Riley asking how he died, to which Ellie can end up revealing that he had a heart attack, with Riley being amazed at someone that can actually die of natural causes in this world. Now here you can also go ahead and search his tent, though that is entirely skippable, though through looking at his stuff you can find an old photo of Winston in his youth, and we of Riley finding a bottle of whiskey that you're given the choice of accepting or declining a sip, where accepting will have Ellie spitting it out to Riley's amusement. But continuing down the path, there's another optional conversation to be had, from interacting with a saddle on a nearby bench, which will turn the conversation to talking about Winston's horse Princess, with her sadly having been taken away after Winston's death. To progress through the story, we end up reaching the end of the hallway where the path is blocked by a bunch of rubble, and after an attempt to lift the metal pole together to open the path, the rubble ends up giving way anyway, meaning that we have to find another way through, which I should mention, obviously, just like the original game, the fact that you are alongside Riley for these interactions and working with her to progress through these areas ends up adding to your bond with the character along with Ellie's bond to her. But the way to progress is through going to a nearby Halloween store where Ellie has to boost Riley up so she can lock it from the other side, to where despite the door opening a few seconds later, no one ends up coming through, being pretty clear setup to the fact that Riley is messing with Ellie here, where once Ellie enters, she ends up being scared by Riley, who's now wearing a clown mask, with Ellie being upset that she's done this 2 times today. But either way, Riley is still excited to be here, to where she ends up prompting Ellie to put on a nearby wolf mask, telling her how badass it looks, all while Ellie thinks it looks stupid. Then when putting it on, Riley ends up telling her that she wants to hear her roar, to where you end up having to push the triangle button to get Ellie to roar, to which initially it is a very feeble one, which Riley isn't impressed, and tells her that she wants to hear her fucking roar, leading to you having to bash on the triangle button to do a loud roar, with Riley laughing from joy when she does so. Obviously, this being Riley trying to get Ellie to come out of her shell, obviously adding more to this relationship here, and how being with Riley does allow Ellie to be her true self, something that she clearly struggles with when being around others, considering how alone she clearly feels without Riley. Throughout this, you can have the pair still continuing to rummage through a store with numerous things to interact, though a lot of this is easily skippable, as you can literally just leave the room whenever you want, which misses out on some nice moments between the pair, where you have things like interacting with a jar of eyeballs that leads to Ellie being confused by the concept. And when turning around, you see Riley coming out of a coffin, now wearing a Frankenstein mask. You can walk over to the vampire display, which has Riley putting on a Dracula mask, saying, "I am Count Dracula," only for an optional conversation to then appear, which will have Ellie telling her to call herself Countess Dracula, which Riley ends up repeating as well. Ellie herself can also swap out masks, one of them being a triple phoenix mask, which ends up being another reference to American Dreams, with it being a game that is mentioned there. Though following this, we do also see Riley changing masks to her now wearing a Care Bear-esque mask, which look kind of weird. You can also get a Wicked Witch mask, which when doing so has Ellie doing an impersonation for Riley, which I will mention. How do they know Wizard of Oz? Is that really something they're learning post-apocalypse, is Wizard of Oz? By the way, probably the most fun piece of side content here does come from interacting with Skeleseer, a toy that functions very similarly to a Magic 8-Ball, where you obviously ask it questions and shake it and look at the response it gives you, to which Ellie can ask it a myriad of questions, many of which being about the future, the first of which being, "Are we gonna die today?" to which she gets nothing, to which she then proceeds to say a slur, which is weird, which, I mean, this was 10 years ago, and I don't know if the calling out of this word was as prominent back then, though it was pretty jarring to see it during my latest replay. Though this is when Riley tells Ellie that she's not getting anything because she obviously has to turn it around to see the answer, to which I guess this kind of makes Ellie come off as a bit of an idiot, but we then have her asking some dumb questions like, will we ever get our water guns back, to which Riley ends up telling her to let it go once again. We have her asking if she's ever going to get boobs, or are you a butt face? She asks if Riley will ever stop sucking at poker, to which Riley even admits that she's given up on that. But this section ends with Riley doing one of her own, asking if Ellie will ever be as funny as her, to which it says, "Not in this existence," to which Ellie responds with, "Skeleseer can suck my dick," which is a funny little moment. By the way, obviously the way to progress the story is to leave the room, to which ends up finding them on a balcony with an area below, which ends up being the room that we spend the following flashback chapter in. Though here Riley ends up noticing 2 cars beneath them, and here she ends up challenging Ellie to see who can smash all the windows of their cars with bricks the quickest, with Ellie claiming to be a brick master, where the winner of the challenge gets to ask the loser a question that they have to answer seriously, which ends up being a fun little mini game here between the two, kind of being this little bit of combat to a degree of you having to obviously precisely throw these bricks to destroy the windows, to where if you win, Ellie will yell out "brick trick fucking master in a humorous way, and we'll have Riley claiming that she had tougher windows, though it is here where we're given the option of 3 questions to ask her, or simply just not asking one at all. Now, really, none of these questions really add that much of substance. None of it is stuff that you really need to know to get the rest of the plot. They all end up being nice little moments here where you can ask about Ellie's mom, to which Riley will tell her that Marlene mentions her a lot and that they were close friends despite fighting, obviously bringing these parallels of Riley and Ellie to that of Marlene and her mom. Now, the other 2 questions kind of both revolve around the same thing, one being asking why Riley left her without telling her, and the other one being why she lashed out at her when she left, both of which essentially having Riley saying that she needed her space and saying that Ellie kept trying to get close to her, something Ellie defends, saying that it was because she cared about Riley, once again implying these romantic undertones. Now, obviously, you can also just lose this competition, which really that goes with all of these little games that you have with Riley, to where you could technically fail all of them and still progress through the story. But through losing, Riley will ask Ellie what it will take for them to be friends again, to which Ellie initially jokes a spaceship, being this typical type of response that we've seen from her in awkward situations, similar to what happened during her conversation with Sam in the original game. And is another line that is a reference here. I'm referring back to when Ellie mentioned that she wanted to be an astronaut back in the original game. Also something that is later referred back to at the time of Last of Us 2, where Ellie does go into the spaceship at the museum, but eventually she does give in to Riley wanting her to take it seriously, to where she just tells her to keep doing what you're doing, with clearly the relationship starting to mend here. Though after this, Riley ends up telling Ellie that they're close to her revealing her surprise, where we do have them heading down a flight of stairs, where along the way Riley starts to talk about the surprise, mentioning that the military secretly does have plenty of power around the city, but have just flipped the circuit breakers off, thus preventing the power from reaching anywhere that the military doesn't want it to, again showing them as really controlling once again. Though this is where you end up entering a control room. That is, if you don't want to stop at the room next by, which does end up having a pretty superfluous collectible in it. But once you reach the circuit breaker, Riley ends up breaking the lock off, telling Ellie to flip the switch, to which she ends up being skeptical that it will work, though when doing so, the lights in her room start activating, leading to Ellie's surprise, with them now obviously having a whole mall to explore with things that they haven't done before, which essentially ends up being the bulk of the following chapter, which is also just kind of, again, this nice change of pace for the series, with there now being excitement to see if the whole place is lit up, kind of reminding you just how sheltered the likes of Ellie and Riley and really just all the people in the quarantine zone are here. The fact that they have been without electricity, well, outside of what is completely necessary to survive, really for their entire lives. And just the concept of going to a mall as they do here is considered this really special occasion, something that obviously most people in society take for granted nowadays. But anyway, here we do have Ellie wondering whether the soldiers will know that the lights are on, to which Riley ends up assuring her that it's just the interior lights that are on. The exterior ones are broken, conveniently. Again, just really feels like an excuse for why they're not being caught in this instance. But anyway, passing through a hallway does lead to a set of doors leading to the room that we were overseeing earlier, where before they open them, Ellie ends up stopping Riley, telling her that she knows what she's trying to do, and that she's glad she's not dead, and glad that they're back together, with Riley now apologizing for the things that she had said previously, right before she had left, clearly showing the relationship starting to mend, which leads to the overtly positive tone at the start of the next flashback chapter. And here we do have Ellie telling Riley that she's a sap, to which they both laugh as they entered the light-filled room, ending the chapter, though something that's so minuscule, but I do want to mention it here, is the fact that transition between chapters here ends up actually changing between the original game and the remake, where here we do have the transition here being a cut to black, while in the remake, for some reason, they decided to making a piercing white light that consumes the screen. That, again, makes sense in the fact that obviously Ellie is now seeing these bright lights in the flashback, while in the modern day, she's also looking into the sky, which has a bright light as well. So again, it makes sense why this bright light would be this transition, especially when they're trying to make these transitions seamless. But I always found it super jarring in the remake, to where I actually do prefer the original's transition better, even though that was more so due to limitations of them needing to load the following section in at the time. But either way, we reached the third chapter in the DLC, that being So Close, taking us back to the present day, with this being a way more gameplay-centric chapter, starting it right where we left off with Ellie, having just jumped over the railing and now looking upwards towards the military helicopter, which is on the floor above. Though we end up noticing a medical emblem on the helicopter, which is obviously a good sign to it potentially having the medical supplies Ellie is looking for, but we have to find our way up. We're exploring this area as you potentially finding crafting materials, and again, another note that tells you what happened to this group, with it being next to a soldier that had his arm amputated, clearly an attempt to save himself after being bitten. Though, as expected, the path to the helicopter ends up being blocked off by a gate, one that does require power to be operated, which leads to us having to follow the electrical wires to find a way to power it back up, with Ellie seeming to have picked up on that notion from Joel. Obviously a nice little moment there, showing what she's learned from him. But anyway, this all has us reaching the maintenance hallway, though before entering it, you do get your first bunch of ammo, which is obviously an indication of the upcoming enemy encounter. Though navigating through the hallway, you do get this jump scare from a cat running away from you, which makes you question why don't we see animals like this a bit more often in the Last of Us series. But progressing has us finding a door that leads directly into the shipping room that we're trying to enter, though it ends up being obviously blocked off, meaning that we have to instead go through a flooded path, through which the cat will jump scare us once again through running across the vents, though eventually we end up entering the flooded shipping room through the back door, where it's at this point where we can find the wires ending at a generator that is conveniently out of gas, because obviously, though also conveniently, there's an empty gas can right behind Ellie. That now makes it so that the goal is to siphon some gas out of one of the nearby trucks in the room. Now I should mention there's another collectible right next to the generator that continues the storyline about the soldiers, though there's also a locked gate to the side that leads to a ladder that goes up to the vents that we can't currently access due to having no power. Anyway, heading towards the trucks starts our first true enemy encounter in the game, it being one where 4 stalkers end up spawning in, which proves to be a somewhat difficult fight, largely in the fact that you are only given pistol ammo for this fight, which is obviously relatively weak in the grand scheme of things, and also the fact that you are fighting against stalkers, which is interesting in its own right considering their limited appearance in the original game, though I don't like stalkers, which I mentioned in my original video, as just annoying to have them being able to hide constantly, and even then they don't even make sense canon-wise. But also, if you don't get headshots on these, they end up taking 3 hits each, which considering the fact that they're prone to running up to you and attacking you, it can lead to some frustrating situations where you simply don't get to shoot them enough times to stop them before they damage you. But I should also mention that you do also obviously still have the Switchblade, which while Switchblade combat with Ellie is not particularly powerful, with it having less stun power than melee combat as Joel, it still ends up being a pretty effective weapon if you're able to stun your enemies first. Well, also I should mention that through all the crafted materials that you've encountered along the way, at least on normal difficulty, you're now able to craft a Molotov and a nail bomb, which obviously you can use those in this encounter as well, though I rarely ever do. And really just as a whole, this fight ends up being largely superfluous, again kind of just here to add gameplay and add more stakes to what we're currently doing, which I will say just in general, the entire notion of Ellie fighting all these infected to find the medical supplies for Joel and then eventually get back to him is adding to her character. It is showing how far she's willing to fight to get back with Joel and save Joel, though I feel like this individual fight doesn't really do much to really add to that overall notion. But after you kill the 4 infected, you obviously have to search the room, going to the nearby trucks to look for gas, and the one with the gas ends up being the second semi that you end up passing by, to where after getting the gas you can return to the generator to activate it, to which when doing so we conveniently have more stalkers running towards us, only for a cable to conveniently drop into the water, electrifying the water and killing the stalkers before they get to us, which is again extremely convenient. But through this we now have the gate to the ladder now activated, which allows us to go through it, climb up the ladder, go into the vents, and navigate our way to the top of the first semi we had previously passed. Now I will mention that going through the vents here can be kind of annoying in the fact that it is kind of easy to fall off them, especially if you're trying to go through them pretty quickly, which can lead to some annoying deaths, especially considering the checkpoint is back on the ground level. Now I should also mention the fact that they did actually create a new death animation for Ellie here, for her falling into the water, which again, the rest of the death animations are obviously just repeats of those from the original game, from the short Ellie section there, which really again is also a cost-saving measure from this DLC, and the fact that all this gameplay here does play very similarly to the gameplay from the winter section. Anyway, again, when reaching the top of the semi, you can technically go to the hood to where you can find some alcohol there, though really the way to exit is going to the other side to where you can explore the loading dock to where it's at this point where it becomes clear that the exit is on the other side of the room at a door that's now been powered up, meaning that you have to go back up to the vents to get to that door, with this being a minor puzzle section on how to get back up, where you can raise the garage door near the vents and through that use it as a bridge to get to the vents, though when standing on it, it causes the door to collapse, meaning that you need to find something to hold it up. Which the way to do this is by opening the other garage, which inside you conveniently find a cart that's just tall enough to hold the door open, which again, super convenient, which if you put it in place underneath the garage door that you tried to climb across last time, this time it'll hold it up and you can cross unfettered outside of a minor drop that happens when you first step on it. Though, interestingly, there's another way to get up, which is clearly not intended by the developers, though if you just get that cart from the beginning and bring it to the corner near the railing at the end of the loading dock, you can actually climb up the cart itself and then get to the vents that way, which obviously saves time and is what you do in a speedrun. But obviously this is something that wasn't meant to be done here. But anyway, you obviously navigate through the vents to get to the other side of the room, where you go through the powered doors to now enter a pet store, which is filled with a wide range of infected, including a few clickers, which facing off against clickers as Ellie in particular is extremely annoying, as at least with Joel, obviously you have the ability to get the Shiv Master ability. That means that if a clicker catches up to you, you at least have an opportunity to kill it with the Shiv. Ellie doesn't have that luxury, to where no matter what, if a clicker runs up to Ellie, she ends up instantly dying. This can be a very annoying encounter, especially considering the way to end this encounter is by getting to the very end of the room, where it does take some time to end up opening the door at the end. Along with the fact that there's also a runner that's conveniently placed right in front of the door that makes it even more difficult to escape. Obviously meaning that just running straight towards the door won't end up working, as that infected will end up attacking you before you get the door open. Now, the game does technically hand you some supplies in this area, where there's obviously a wide number of bottles that you can pick up to throw to distract the enemies. Also, there's a Molotov in the room, where obviously you can use the bottle to group them all together and use the Molotov to kill them, or you could just go full Rambo and just try to kill all of them, as by this point you also do have a decent amount of ammo as well, though again still relegated to just the pistol. So again, just a wide range of ways to complete this enemy encounter. But after that encounter, we end up back in the room with the helicopter, where it's here where we can hear some infected in the room as well, where they end up approaching us as we near the gate, where typically I just run by them, as you don't have to kill them anyway, but you can obviously kill them, which will allow you to freely explore the top floor, which does have a recorder from one of the soldiers, though obviously the way to progress is through climbing the escalator and walking along some glass panels to jump into the helicopter, which is built up as this tense moment. And as Ellie lands on the helicopter, it almost ends up falling out of place, but Ellie is still able to scurry over to a health kit, seeing that the supplies are still inside, and starts hugging it, saying, "I'm not letting you go." Once again, really highlighting how hard that she's willing to fight to keep Joel alive, which ends up ending the chapter as we cut to chapter 4, Fun and Games, which, what do you know, most of the chapter ends up involving fun and games, where we continue off directly from where we left off in the last flashback, strangely replaying the end of that chapter but from a different angle, with us now seeing the scene from behind Ellie and Riley and seeing what they were amazed at, seeing a fully operational and lit up carousel in the middle of the room. This obviously again being the same room where they were throwing bricks into previously, which obviously does allow us to see the cars with the broken windows to the side, to which if Ellie won the brick throwing contest, she can stand on top of the red car and brag about her victory, which is something that I didn't even know was in the game until my research for this video. Though otherwise, Riley will urge Ellie to get on the carousel for a ride, something that feels very integral to the story here, but is actually something you could just completely skip, where the only thing that's actually mandatory to progress the story in this area is to go upstairs and walking up to the lit up arcade machine, where everything else is purely optional. But I feel like skipping out on a lot of that is really just skipping out what makes Left Behind great, where you are missing out on this downtime between these two characters, getting to see their bond and see them rebuilding their relationship, showing that the love they have for each other. As Ellie riding the carousel here is really this great moment, this moment of Ellie showing her childlike innocence, though sadly it doesn't end up lasting too long, as Ellie ends up insisting that Riley joins her, but just as she does, the carousel grinds to a halt, much to her dismay, but Ellie confirms to her that she loved it, with Ellie at this point clearly having fun, despite her hesitancy to express enjoyment earlier on, and it's here where Riley reveals that she has something else to give her, taking out a joke book, with Ellie being excited that she found a new one, with this obviously adding more context to the joke books in the original game, with the reveal that it had a personal connection to her due to her connection to Riley, while also just adding to this quirk of Ellie's that she just loves puns. And it's after this where Ellie does say that you might just be my favorite person again, and Riley ends up saying I know my girl, clearly furthering these romantic undertones. But when exiting the carousel here, we do have the ability to continue on telling jokes from the joke book, where really you're able to stop at any time, though it's really ends up being a pretty lengthy sequence of just joke after joke after joke, with this being filled with pretty fun interactions between the two nerding out over these puns. But once putting it away, we then have Riley noticing that the photo booth is on and tells Ellie that they're so doing this, to where they end up entering it together, clearly not knowing what they're doing while inside, having to pick a theme between love, friends, or cool, where when picking love, Riley says, "Are you trying to woo me?" which implies Riley's feelings there. So as the photos are taken, you then get the choice between what poses Ellie and Riley end up doing, which first you're told to smile, and then you get the choice between a pose of you getting closer to Riley, where Riley will end up giving Ellie bunny ears, or they'll end up doing an angel pose. Then you're told to do something creepy, which you can choose between moving in close to the camera or pretending to see a dinosaur for some reason. You then get them having to make an ugly face, to where you can pick between a pufferfish or a squishy face. Then you have them making a silly face, to where you can have them making a pig nose, or for some reason do a sexy pose, which is just weird. And just the way that Ellie says so sexy during this just feels really icky. But really, you can retry this as much as you want. But once you're finished, you get the option of sharing this on Facebook, to which they're obviously confused over what Facebook is, and instead obviously choose to print out the photos, only for the printer to be out of order, leading to them hitting the screen and breaking it, obviously laughing at their misfortune. Again, this really nice moment, and this is a really fun moment between the two, once again showing them making the most out of how little that they have here, and showing them just genuinely having fun. Now, when leaving the photo booth, you can continue to explore the bottom floor, but you end up overhearing the intercom lady revealing that the 6 a.m. shift starts in 10 minutes, obviously alluding to the fact that the time for Ellie to return is nearing, but instead we end up having them mocking her voice here instead, and end up doing this impersonation of how they would do the voice, and kind of plays into the sexy voice that they did earlier, which is just also weird. Now, there is a collectible in this area, where in the restaurant kitchen you can find a note from Winston that details an embarrassing moment for Ellie, of him catching her crying while visiting him in the past. Though the story does progress through climbing up the escalator, which is now working, which has Ellie being amazed at how you can run up them, something that they end up really hamming up for the HBO show. But this all leads up to their arrival at Raja's Arcade, a clear reference to Eddie Raja from Uncharted, which is random, though this is something that once again comes from American Dreams. And while in here you can see a number of fake arcade machines, most of which are turned off, with one of them even being a Jack X machine, obviously a reference to an earlier Naughty Dog game where through interacting with it, Ellie will then fantasize about playing a racing game, which leads to a fun little cutscene there. The way to progress here is through finding the turning machine, where you find the machine with the screen on, but filled with static, clearly not functional. With this again being a game that was referred to in the original game, where you can find a machine of it in Billstown, and Ellie will talk about her connection to it, though Ellie will obviously be disappointed that the game is busted here, saying that she thought for a second she was going to play it. So clearly seeing Ellie's disappointment, we then have Riley saying that she still can, tells her to close her eyes, and we have Riley guiding her through imagining playing the game. This really great moment between the two, where again, clearly there is a reason why this is the one that they forced to be the one necessary for the main story. It is one that really just emphasizes the childlike innocence of these two characters, and really just showing you how much Riley cares about Ellie, how far out of the way she's going to prove to Ellie how much she cares and how much she wants to make her happy. And really, I feel like this scene here is one that's so much more impactful in the game than it is in the HBO show, where in the HBO show, they actually do what they initially were planning on doing, which is getting the rights to Mortal Kombat here, and through that actually have Riley and Ellie playing Mortal Kombat, which I think is worse as again, it takes away this aspect of Riley doing everything she can to keep Ellie happy, also lessening the childlike innocence between the two, and also just feeling like them putting in a reference to Mortal Kombat for the sake of it because they thought it was cool to have Mortal Kombat in there. Or again, I feel like here this is an instance where budgetary cuts actually end up booning the story anyway, where here we have Riley talking Ellie through playing the game, describing the characters and the locations and teaching her the controls, telling her that she's playing as the unstoppable, claw-wielding, yet drop-dead gorgeous Angel Knives. To which Ellie initially doesn't buy into this, saying that, am I supposed to picture this? Though eventually does buy into it, being told that her opponent is Black Fang, who is a super ripped white dude with 3 arms, and on screen comes the typical fighting game tropes of round 1, fight, with health bars for the characters on the top of the screen, and Riley ended up describing the fight, to which Ellie will have to do maneuvers, to where Ellie will have to react to the moves that Riley is saying, to where it has us playing these quick time events to progress through the fight, where again, this is another instance where you can win or lose. It doesn't really change the story, though it does change up Riley's dialogue, though again, it doesn't really have a major effect on anything. But it's following this sequence that we do get to our first pre-rendered cutscene since the beginning of the game. This chapter is strangely containing 3 of the DLC's 5 cutscenes, with Riley asking Ellie how it was. They're saying it was alright, only for Riley to counter with "you loved it," and Ellie finally admitting to that fact. Though it's in this instance where Riley starts to hear some music playing in the distance and wants to go explore it, but Ellie tells Riley that they should head back, with Riley not listening to her, wanting to go anyway. Ellie is resistant here, saying that she has no strikes left at this place and that they could just pick it up tomorrow, leading to a big reveal here, and Riley saying that she can't, telling Ellie that the Fireflies have asked her to leave and that she's leaving Boston, join a group in another city, clearly something she doesn't want to do, saying she argued with them to let her stay, but Marlene was insistent, with her claiming that Ellie knows how Marlene is and that everything is a test, which, I mean, again, I guess we know that, but Riley will be leaving tomorrow, with Ellie obviously just glaring at her in clear disappointment, who after a while ends up saying okay, which we clearly see Riley's disappointment in this response. Where I will say something that this DLC does a lot better than the HBO show is give an added layer of subtext to this entire flashback sequence. So your initial thought is that Riley is bringing Ellie here to spend one last day with Ellie, but in reality, something that you can clearly tell through the way that Riley reacts to Ellie in these sequences is that she didn't bring Ellie here to spend one last day with her, but instead brought Ellie here because she wants Ellie to convince her to stay. She wants to win Ellie back and have a reason to stay here for. And Ellie does recognize her disappointment, with Ellie saying, "What do you want me to say?" And her asking Riley why she brought her here. But they're having to ask the question 2 times to get a straight answer from Riley, who just says, "I don't know." Again, obviously there being this clear romantic tension between the two, to where obviously that is the reason why she is here, but they're both extremely nervous about revealing their feelings to each other, and through that end up pushing each other away here, with Ellie telling her to go. It says that we should just say our goodbyes, with Riley not really taking to that response, instead saying that she's going to check out the music and walks away, with Ellie clearly struggling to come to terms with her thoughts here, looking at the picture of Angel Knives on the side of the machine before deciding to chase after Riley, with this obviously reopening the rift between Ellie and Riley, something that the HBO version of the show decided to add this added aspect to it, in the fact that the mall was also being used as an armory for the Fireflies and Riley was stationed there, which I think you can argue adds more complexity to Riley's role as a Firefly and to the group as a whole, which is probably why they added it there, though I think it's another one of these instances where the HBO show changes something for the negative, where I do think it largely takes away from Riley's connection to Ellie, where I think something that makes it so powerful in this game is the fact that Riley's going so far out of her way to try to appease Ellie, that she is breaking the rules and even meeting up with Ellie to begin with, actively sought out this mall and the way to turn on its power in a way to appease Ellie, over HBO version, which just simply has her being stationed there, to which she obviously knew it had power, and through that it minimizes the lengths that Riley goes through to appease Ellie. So it's another thing that I think the game does better than the show. But following this, we end up getting a pretty short bit of gameplay, navigating through the back room in order to catch up with Riley, which ends up being a pretty pointless section gameplay-wise, with it just being vaulting over or ducking under some obstacles, though it does end up breaking up this argument between Ellie and Riley, giving time for us and Ellie to think about that argument, though otherwise it really could have just been one singular long cutscene. As following this, we get the next cutscene of us entering the department store, finding Riley standing in the middle of the room, being amazed at a reanimated display, though the argument ends up reigniting right away, with Ellie asking her, are we just done talking? And Riley saying, I don't know, are we? With Ellie saying that you don't get to be pissed off at me, I'm pissed off at you, with it now coming out that Ellie still holds resentment for the way she left, saying that we were good, we were better than good, calling Riley out for feeling guilty and wanting an out, to which she's giving it to her. But then we get Riley really emphasizing how much she's done for Ellie here, saying that she's supposed to be holed up on the other side of town, that if she gets caught as a firefly here, she's dead, saying that guilt didn't make me come across a city full of soldiers. Clearly feeling like the romantic tension is boiling at this point, with obviously the implication that she came back for Ellie, and she admits that she did some shit that she doesn't know how to take back, but she's trying. To which it's here where she reveals another surprise for Ellie, to which she removes her backpack, tosses it to the floor, revealing inside to be 2 water guns. Obviously the ones that the corporal took from Ellie that she failed in getting back, saying that she nearly got shot getting these, once again highlighting how much she's doing for Ellie in this instance. And instantly we see Ellie turning this back into banter with her, saying that she's going to destroy her before passing her a gun, and that then they'll talk, which I will say is kind of dumb, as it's really just an excuse to have more gameplay here, as following this obviously we do get this water gun fight, even though it doesn't really make that much sense narratively, but again it ends up being a nice little moment of the two playing around, where obviously the water guns don't play that dissimilarly to the normal weapons in the game, particularly the flamethrower, though there's a new mechanic here of you having to pump up your gun to refill its water. In the first encounter here, you essentially have a health bar, aka a soak level, that Ellie and Riley end up shooting each other here, to which whoever fills up the soak meter the quickest ends up winning, to which I should mention I really suck at this for some reason, to where most times I end up losing, though again it's another one of these instances where you don't have to win, as no matter what you can progress the story. Following this we get another new mini game where the two end up playing in a game of cat and mouse, where the first to hit the other with water ends up winning, to which Ellie ends up being the first to seek, to which she counts to 5, saying time to die as she finishes counting, which I've always found a little humorous. And no matter how this game plays out, it still ends up being a best of 3, and again no real difference story wise for who wins, though there's some fun banter between the two either way. This ends up being encounters that are pretty gameable though, where typically Riley ends up being in the same spots during your first 2 encounters, to where you can kind of just run up to her and shoot her, which can kind of make this go by pretty quickly, but otherwise you're probably supposed to be using your survival instincts in order to find her. But either way, this leads to the final cinematics of the chapter, where after one of you are declared the winner, Riley wants to go again, only for Ellie to tell her that she would love to do this all day, but she actually has to go back, with Riley finally accepting her this time, but asks if she can walk her home, once again being clear romantic undertones. This finally transitions us to a pre-rendered cutscene, which really is the culmination of the Ellie and Riley relationship, where Ellie and Riley finally talk, with Ellie telling Riley that she meant it, and Riley should go, as it's something that she's always wanted, where it's in this moment where Riley is again clearly disappointed by this response. Though Ellie says that who am I to stop you? And Riley says you're the one person that can. And in Ellie fashion, she jokingly responds at first, saying that she'll be so miserable without her, but then says I'll be fine and we're gonna see each other again, which is kind of even sadder considering obviously this is their last day together, regardless of what would have happened here. But Riley then allows Ellie to keep her water guns, as I mean really what is she gonna do with water guns? Then asks Ellie if she still lugs around that Walkman, which again, the importance of the Walkman comes back to American Dreams, where Riley ends up stealing it from Ellie, which ends up being their first interaction, though Ellie ends up handing it to her here, with her revealing that inside is the tape that Riley ended up giving to her, and Riley saying, you really are miserable without me. But here we end up seeing Riley walking over to the stereo system and plugs the Walkman in, which I guess she knows how to do. But the song that ends up playing here, which really plays throughout the rest of this scene and also the beginning of the next chapter, ends up being I Got You Babe, with this being a cover by Etta James, which really just the song in general is the perfect song to be playing here. Obviously being this very romantic song, implying the romantic relationship between Ellie and Riley, and one that is also thematically appropriate for this scene and also thematically heartbreaking considering the outcome of the Ellie and Riley relationship. But also I feel like the Etta James version of it in particular here is also the correct version to go with. Where obviously the original version's by Sonny and Cher, where that version's a lot slower and doesn't really have the oomph that this version does, where I do feel like this version just comes off as a lot more powerful to me. But in reaction to the music, we do have Riley standing up on the jewelry table and starts dancing around, telling Ellie to get your ass up here, with Ellie again saying that this is so stupid, which I mean, it is, though it could have been even more stupid considering the HBO version had them doing this with their Halloween masks on, which is dumb. But here Riley ends up getting Ellie to start dancing and once again gets Ellie to come out of her shell, with the two dancing around the table, only for Ellie to eventually stop, smiling to herself, with her clearly having fully recognized just how happy Riley ends up making her, to where Riley ends up attempting to get her to dance again, but Ellie's face now turns to sadness, with her resisting, and Riley asking her what's wrong, to where we have Ellie say, "Don't go." Clearly now recognizing what it would mean to lose Riley in this situation, which again is tragic considering no matter what she's going to lose Riley. Now we have her being fully open with her love of Riley, and Riley in this instance obviously seems relieved. Again, this is what she wanted from the very beginning, is for Ellie to give her a reason to stay, as she obviously has always loved Ellie as well, and now knows that Ellie feels the same way about her. Towards in this instance where we see her pulling off the pendant from her neck and tossing it to the floor, clearly showing that the fireflies don't mean as much to her as Ellie does. And it's also in this moment where we get a pretty big moment for Ellie, where she ends up reaching out, where we see her instantly kissing Riley for a moment before pulling back, saying "I'm sorry," only for Riley to say, "For what?" and Ellie being relieved, obviously being this confirmation that Ellie is a lesbian, something that is implied in the original game, though never explicitly said, and I think it's a very welcome addition to the story here, obviously being this great LGBT representation in the gaming medium, where obviously Ellie was already a well-revered character before this DLC had come out, and The Last of Us in general was obviously extremely popular of a game, to where I think obviously the reveal that Ellie is a lesbian is, again, just nice representation. Now, sadly also, there's obviously haters and straight up homophobes out there that do hate the fact that Ellie was a lesbian, and sadly this sort of homophobia is still pretty prominent in the gaming community, as evidenced by something like Horizon Forbidden West's DLC Burning Shores, which had a similar reveal, to which there was a major negative backlash to that, which is again just stupid. And if anything, I think this reveal actually ends up booning the story even more so, adding in this context obviously that Ellie was always in love with Riley, and through that ends up recontextualizing a lot of her conversations with Riley. And I do think it just gives the story greater depth through this reveal, while also making even more tragic, as we'll later see, where it is this moment where Ellie and Riley finally declare their love for each other is sadly the moment that causes them to eventually lose each other. As immediately follow this, we do have Ellie asking, "What do we do now?" And Riley says, "We'll figure it out," saying she doesn't think Marlene's gonna go for it, but is then interrupted before she can finish that statement, with them hearing some infected in the distance, who again conveniently show up in this moment. Now obviously the implication is that the music is what called them out, though still, if there's infected in this area, I feel like it is still kind of dumb that they don't encounter a single one until this one moment, this single moment immediately after they declared their love for each other. But either way, a runner does end up seeing them and ends up sprinting towards the direction where Riley pulls out her pistol, which ends up concluding the chapter, obviously being this dark reminder of Riley's fate, where we obviously already know that Riley does end up getting bitten and does end up dying, something we learn at the end of the OG game, with it being pretty clear at this point that this is direct setup to that moment. But with that, we do cut back to the present for the penultimate chapter, Enemy of My Enemy, a chapter with very little narrative progression, as it really is just Ellie finding her way back to Joel, now having secured the medical kit, during which we get a series of enemy encounters, and while some of it feels like it's here for the sake of just adding in more combat, again, it does emphasize how hard Ellie is fighting to still be with Joel, something that we see later being directly tied to the lessons she learned from Riley. But the chapter does start with us still on the military helicopter, with Ellie still hugging the med kit, only to be snapped out of it by the sounds of gunshots and infected realizing that Joel is in trouble, and also playing into a major theme of the upcoming enemy encounters, and also the title of this chapter, in that many of the upcoming encounters involve both human and infected enemies. Something missing from the OG game, supposedly due to time constraints, as supposedly they were going to add these style of encounters in the Pittsburgh section of the game, but they're obviously added here, and it does add an interesting dynamic to combat. Adding more variety on how to approach encounters, where now you obviously have the ability to alert the infected and use them as distractions for human enemies. Though I will say at the end of the day, I don't think it actually adds that much. I mean, it does add some immersion to it all, and again, adds more variety, but to be honest, the lack of interactions involving both type of enemies in the original game is something that I never even noticed until I later played this game and recognized how this game added that feature. But anyway, we then end up exiting the helicopter to where we end up proceeding down a hall, during which we can find a photo of the military unit from a decaying corpse. Though jumping over a ledge leads to us hearing some men running from a couple clickers, and Ellie goes to hide as they run out of the store, and two of the men end up being killed by these clickers before the remaining men end up finishing the clickers off. Though in the process, one of the dead man's bows end up sliding across the room, conveniently right to Ellie, giving her a new weapon for her arsenal, and also assumingly explaining how she got a bow by the time of the winter chapter, with this group also having added context to it from playing the OG game, where the enemies we fight in this section are obviously a group searching for Ellie here, obviously being the group from the university, aka David's group, which is some cool connective tissue, though also in a way is actually kind of bad, as it kind of lessens the David reveal, as again, Ellie knows that this is a group that's chasing after her. She overhears them saying that, so the fact that she's so surprised by David being part of that group is just kind of dumb, actually. But either way, we can potentially have a combat encounter here against the three remaining men, which one of the men here are clearly disillusioned with the group, saying, "Why do we care about an old man and a little girl?" To which this guy is clearly voiced by Travis Willingham, which is very jarring as it just sounds like his normal voice. Now again, this combat encounter can be used as practice for your bow and arrow, especially considering there's a decent amount of arrows in the room, though really you could just run through this section without much difficulty if you know where to go, where you could just literally run to the hallway to the side and get into the vent that you're supposed to progress through without taking any damage. Though getting to the vent does have a blood trail that following it does lead to a body and your last collectible in the game, which ends up being a recorder that reveals the fate of the last survivor from the helicopter group. Though going in the opposite way progresses the campaign, exiting into another store, being the first encounter that does contain both human and infected enemies. The shame is that it's also an encounter that is actually easier if you just run through it, where when dropping into the store, there is a group of clickers immediately below you, though there's also a group of human enemies at the other side of the store, and no matter what, they'll go after each other if you just run through the store. Though there's a bit of an annoying aspect of this fight in that if you do jump down right in front of one of the clickers, they can just instantly kill you, which can be pretty annoying to die that way. Though either way, again, kind of an underwhelming encounter there, and the way to progress is obviously through leaving the store through an opening on the left to where you end up climbing over a ledge on the other side of the hallway to reach another store, which is essentially a more difficult version of the previous encounter, where you enter at the back of the store, and by walking forward, you'll notice that there are some infected to the side, and when you approach the exit to the room, 4 human enemies end up spawning in, and having just gone through the garage door at the top, and the way to progress is obviously through reaching that door, though you have to avoid being attacked while opening it, as it's one that takes a while to open, which can make this a pretty difficult encounter. Now obviously you could just straight up just wait, and eventually the human and infected will end up attacking each other, which makes it pretty easy to escape that way. Though if you want to go through it quickly or speed run the game, this actually ends up being a pretty brutal encounter, where it's just so easy for the group at the end to end up taking you down before you can get the door open. But again, it is one that you can technically run through, and you don't have to technically kill anybody, though getting through this gate takes us back to the opening plaza, being right next to the American Princess store, allowing for a short walk back to the open area where it all began, where obviously we get our final fight in the game. Probably the most difficult fight in possibly the entire Last of Us series, where again, you are playing as Ellie, taking on wave after wave of enemies just to get back to Joel, which again does have a great thematic message to it. It's brutally difficult enemy encounter that does lead to your reunion with Joel and you being able to fix Joel up, but it's also again kind of dumb that this is a thing, as again, how is this little girl taking on dozens of human enemies and also some infected? But either way, there's a funny little aspect of this section that I didn't even know. Is that if you don't actually engage with the enemies soon enough, it will actually be considered a game over, where they'll just break into the room containing Joel and kill him off screen, which I didn't even know that was a thing. But obviously this is again a forced enemy encounter. You do need to kill everybody in the room to progress, though the game does hand you a bevy of pistol ammo and arrows before entering, though again it's still just pistol ammo, which is relatively weak. And again, Ellie is largely defenseless here, where melee combat is really ineffective against human enemies here, unless they're taken from behind or stunned first. So again, even on easier difficulties, this is a pretty tough fight, though on easier difficulties, they do give you a few checkpoints along the way. Though strangely, the checkpoints themselves are seemingly glitched. Where, I mean, the OG game does this sometimes too, where if you do hit the restart checkpoint in the main menu, after some of these mid-encounter checkpoints, instead of sending you to that checkpoint, it'll send you to the very beginning of the fight, which can be pretty annoying. And really, enemies end up coming here from all corners, where even a store to the right that was initially blocked off when we first were here is now open, which again gives you this pretty open field to take down these enemies in a variety of ways. Now, at the very beginning of the fight, there are a decent amount of enemies that are clumped together at the garage door, as they're obviously trying to open it, to which it's a perfect time to use a Molotov or a nail bomb to kill all of them at once. You can also start stealth killing some of the ones on the top floor using your bow and arrow, which is pretty effective as well. Though this ends up being annoying in these encounters, that like finding the last few survivors can be a tad difficult, where I usually end up having to use my survival instincts to find them. But again, it's a situation where if they catch you off guard, it's pretty easy to kill Ellie here, and even if they don't, your ammo is relatively slow, where again, it's just kind of a pain here. But finishing the first batch of enemies will then allow you to interact with the garage door, making you think that this is the end of this encounter, only for Ellie to get shot at from behind from a guy with a rifle, revealing a second wave of enemies. This one involving almost a dozen men, being an even more difficult enemy encounter. Now with some of these enemies having rifles themselves, and through that can do more damage to you, though there is a added benefit to that in the fact that if you take out one of the enemies with rifles, you can actually take their rifle, and through that obviously gives you a weapon that is essentially a one-hit kill against most enemies, which is obviously way better to use here. Though after killing 5 human enemies here, the infected start to swarm the lower floor, to which there is a mid-encounter checkpoint here, one that is glitched to where, again, typically when you restart encounter, you would assume that it would start at the point that the checkpoint started, though I noticed that this one strangely starts where you left off, where any enemy that you killed before your death ends up still being dead when you reload in, which is a bit strange. Though this is obviously the final time that we can use infected to our advantage, as they can attack the human enemies as well, though again, Ellie is really susceptible to clickers, with them being instant kills, which can make this fight really frustrating, especially considering you're probably low ammo at this point in the fight. So again, a brutal encounter, that is, unless you glitch it out, where like the beginning of the game, as I mentioned, you can deload the entire area. So if you utilize that trick once again here, you can actually do the entire first part of the fight without killing anyone, as you can literally deload the area, which in essence kills all the enemies, to which the game will be tricked thinking that you finished the first enemy encounter. And for the second part of the fight, you technically can't do it from the very beginning, as the game ends up soft locking you if you do, though if you do it after you kill the first 5 enemies and the infected spawn in, you can then use that trick as well to trick into thinking that you did that part of the fight as well, which obviously these are utilized in Any Speedruns, though even despite that, Any Speedruns of this game are still really brutal. I mean, one, obviously the time has been cut down quite a bit, but even then, the final encounter where you do have to kill 5 enemies is still really tough, where again, you're only working with pistol ammo, which means that you do have to get these very difficult headshots from pretty far away, and there's also a lot of RNG involved on where enemy placements are, so despite the ability to finish the game in around 5 minutes, it still is a really brutal speed run there. But either way, the chapter does end with Ellie yelling that if anyone's left, to not mess with her. Again, still dumb that this kid killed numerous adult men, and the fact that David also doesn't care that she did so, as in the main game, he's only upset at Joel. But either way, she ends up opening the garage door, and when she closes it, we cut to black, cutting to flashback once again for the final chapter, Escape from Liberty Gardens, which has us escaping from Liberty Gardens, with us seeing Ellie and Riley now being on the run, run, and this entire sequence gameplay-wise is just us running from infected, where we see them first exiting the department store and barricading the door. Now when leaving, they do mention that they left their backpacks behind, which is kind of just a strange detail to add here, as obviously Ellie does have her backpack by the time of the OG game, which means that she went back for her backpack for some reason. But anyway, we obviously end up running through the back room alongside Riley with I Got You Babe still playing in the background, which is the perfect song to be playing at this point, with obviously them complimenting each other and helping each other through. But when Riley opens the door, she's met with more runners, leading to us having to open a nearby gate instead, to where Ellie goes through and has to find something to prop the door open for some reason. I don't get why Ellie just didn't hold the door as Riley went through, but either way, find a cart nearby and hold it up, leading to Riley having to shoot the lock off of the following door, where you sprint through a truck and end up crawling through some rubble, during which Ellie gets grabbed by a runner, to where we get a quick time event to kick him off. And once escaping from that, we see Riley being attacked, to where we end up saving her there by stabbing it with our switchblade, to which Riley is seemingly surprised at Ellie holding her own in this instance. We end up continuing up the stairs, where we see more infected coming towards us, leading to us jumping out the window to the side and jumping across some scaffolding, to where we see the exit near the roof. After frantically climbing up more scaffolding, Ellie gets to the final one, which conveniently topples over, having Ellie fall back to the ground, where she's attacked by a runner, only for Riley to come back down for her and saving her, only for her to then get attacked by one as well, leading to our final bit of gameplay and us running up to Riley and saving her from the runner. Thematically perfect for this game. And also even that more heartbreaking in that our final instance is us saving Riley from a runner, only for it to turn out that she had already gotten bitten anyway. But either way, this cuts to the last cutscene in the game, where we start off with Ellie pretty brutally slitting the runner's throat, to which she's instantly excited to have gotten rid of all the infected, only for Riley to have a devastated look on her face, telling Ellie about her arm, which I will say is probably the one thing I think the HBO show does slightly better than this version, is having Ellie's nonverbal reaction there clue Ellie in, more so than Riley having to blatantly tell Ellie that she's been bitten. But Ellie ends up looking down to notice the bite, with this being obviously the reveal of how she got bitten and later found out about her immunity that springs forwards the events of the OG game. But Ellie is here shocked, wiping away the blood, and is in disbelief, while Riley ends up revealing that she has also gotten bitten, which I will say is also really convenient that both of them gotten bitten at the same time. And really, it's something that we knew was going to happen. Obviously, this is something that was mentioned in the OG game. We knew that Riley was set up to die, though I think it's something that doesn't really harm the overall product, where typically with prequels, they are typically harmed due to this lack of tension because you know what's going to happen. So I think something about Left Behind here is that it's done in a way that you're not playing the game thinking that, oh, none of this matters because Riley's going to die. You're more so thinking of like, oh, this is making this even more tragic with every scene that you see and every time that you see this shift in the Ellie and Riley relationship. Anyway, with that, we cut back to the present with Ellie having returned to Joel, and uses the medical supplies on him, clearly nervous, but knowing that she has to do it to save him, motivating herself to stay calm. All while we get back to the past, with Ellie smashing up pots with a pipe, reacting angrily to having been bitten, while Riley is on the ground in thought, staying calm, again, implying that Ellie had learned that from Riley. And we have Riley here still joking around, saying that there's more stuff you can break over there. But here we have Ellie crying to her, saying, what are we gonna do? Leading to this great speech to wrap up the game. This speech from Riley that really, again, gives you this insight into Ellie's state of mind, with Ellie clearly taking these words to heart, showing this advice that Riley ends up giving her that ends up having this major impact on her relationship with Joel. Where Riley says here, the way I see it, we have two options. Pulling out her gun, saying, option one, we take the easy way out. It's quick and painless, but says she's not a fan of option one. Well, option two is that they fight. To which Ellie says, fight for what? Seeming to be still devastated that she's going to be turning into one of those things. Obviously, this ironic statement considering we know that she isn't. And it's at this point where we do start to get shots of the modern day now being interspliced with Riley's response, obviously alluding to the fact that the reason why Ellie is doing these things in the modern day is due to what Riley says to her here, where in the present we do see Ellie tying an unconscious Joel to his sled, riding him off in a sandstorm, clearly showing her continuing to fight to keep Joel alive, which is where we have Riley saying that there's a million ways we could have died before today and a million ways we could die tomorrow, but we fight for every second we have to spend with each other. Whether it's 2 minutes or 2 days, we don't give that up. I don't want to give that up. And all this just really showing why Ellie is fighting for the time she has with Joel, while also directly connecting this to the events of the OG game, with obviously Ellie continuing to fight to keep Joel safe in the events of winter. And we also get this great buildup of the music during this sequence as well, which has always stuck to my mind and what makes this moment even more emotional. But then we get the line from Riley that was mentioned in the original game, where Riley says, "My vote, let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together." And while Ellie wants to know about an option 3, Riley obviously just says sorry, which is, again, ironic considering the fact that obviously Ellie herself does have an option 3, something that Riley and most of the rest of humanity don't have. But Riley says, "Let's get out of here," as Ellie ends up wiping the tears, now sitting alone as the music fully swells up and the game ends with the title card coming up. All this being such a bittersweet ending to the game. And really all of it ties back to the overall title of Left Behind, where strangely I'm talking about this at the very end of the video, but the title Left Behind is something that is very reminiscent here. This is literally leading into the moment where Ellie is left behind. She is the one that didn't get to move on. She didn't lose her mind with Riley as she expected, and instead very likely had to be the one that put Riley down, obviously being this massive tragedy. Where I know some people are disappointed in the fact that this DLC did not include the death of Riley and wanted to see more of the events leading up to Ellie meeting up with the Fireflies, but I do feel like that content would have been pretty superfluous. I do feel like we can piece together what would have happened here without it having to be blatantly told to us here, and I do think this ending here is actually more impactful, leaving it on a more bittersweet note than just an outright negative one. One that obviously is much more brutal with you knowing what is to come, and you now fully knowing how much Riley meant to Ellie, while also us now getting to know the relationship between the two, and see how Riley ended up inspiring Ellie to spur on forward. Like, to me, I think this ending is pretty perfect. I do really love how this game concludes, with again it adding more context to Ellie's state of mind in the original game. I think it gives you more of an understanding of why she feels the way she does at the end of the game, us getting to experience the loss that she has gone through, and through that I think it makes the ending of the original game a bit more sympathetic towards Ellie's side of things. Something again that I feel like is a reason why you shouldn't play this DLC until after you play the original game, as I do think it kind of muddies your overall thoughts of the ending of the original game. Where again I think a lot of the complexity of the ending of the original game is your initial thought that you're siding with Joel, until your recognition later that Joel's decision to save Ellie is obviously a lot more complex of a decision than what it initially seemed. And I think this DLC here kind of skews you a little bit more so towards the Ellie side of things, which in essence kind of takes away that initial step of your processing of the ending, which I think takes away a little bit of the complexity from it. But either way, I mean, that is the entirety of Left Behind, which again, while I don't feel like Left Behind is that essential of a piece of the Last of Us experience, I do think it further adds complexity to Ellie's character, along with, again, this expansion on the character of Riley and showing how much she meant to Ellie, while also providing a very unique gameplay experience for the series, mostly filled with fun and games, having this radical different tone in the flashback sequences, while also having a wholly unique series of combat encounters in the present sequences, and the two really playing off of each other in a pretty satisfying way that really perfectly plays off the series' themes. I think this DLC does exactly what it attempts to do very well, and while I don't have as much of a connection to it as much as I do with the OG game, it still remains one of my favorite DLCs, just simply due to how well executed the majority of the experience is. Well, with that, those are my thoughts on the DLC of my favorite game of all time, The Last of Us. Now, moving forward, I do actually have a couple more Last of Us videos for down the road, some smaller scale rankings lined up. Now, I have mentioned in the past, I do want to end up redoing my Last of Us 2 retrospective at some point as well, though I'm really just not sure exactly when I'll get around to that, just due to the fact that it's gonna take forever. It's gonna be massively long. Hopefully at some point I can get around to making that video for some time down the road. Obviously just expect more similar content from the channel down the road, but for now that is the video. Thank you for watching.